Hello, and I am with Liana Kerzner. She is a self-proclaimed mosaic feminist analyst, and she does a lot of things on YouTube. And I'm glad that she's here talking to me today about a very difficult subject, that I have been writing about the past couple of weeks, and revolving around the recent highlighting of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, sexual impropriety, sexual assault in kind of Western society as a whole and the international community. And again, thank you for being here today and talking to me. I guess we could just jump right into it, or is there anything you would like to say to start about this issue and talk about yourself just a little bit?
Well, I guess the critical thing for me in this whole thing, as I was a reporter back in the day, I don't call myself a reporter anymore, and the Gamergate controversy was a big reason because of it. I was happening to be covering video games at the time. I still cover video games, but in a very different format. I feel like the Gamergate controversy was exceptionally poorly reported. I felt like a narrative, I thought a narrative was established too early that lacked a lot of nuance, and it really made me aware of this hyper-partisan, politicized preaching to a narrative instead of investigating truth that goes on in these issues of gender and how gender interacts with media and politics and all these things and power dynamics. And my God, Foucault would be having, a field day with this stuff. And that's what got me interested in the subject specifically of the dynamics of harassment and social and cultural solutions for the cultural problem of harassment. I'm not as interested in law and order because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not as interested in, what the US government or my government up here in Canada is going to do about these things because I'm not a politician. I'm an analyst who cares about people. I grew up in a marginalized community. It was, majority non-white. And I have an approach to that as well, that I come at it from, the To Kill a Mockingbird paradigm, where in this rush to believe accusers, believe women, which I think is a really reductive thing that excludes, the stories of someone like Terry Crews, we forget that there are some historical complications specifically involving sexual assault allegations against men of color. And we have to be really careful with that, because what we don't want to do with these issues is exclude entire swaths of the population that historically have been excluded. And so that's, I guess, the preface that gives people some information about me. Some people have probably already tuned out based on that, and that's a good thing. Your comment section will thank me later.
I guess that's a good place to start, because that's even something I have seen, speaking of comment sections on Facebook as well, is that there are, and I'm going to have to preface this by saying that this is not an attack on feminism at all or anything, but there are certain self-proclaimed feminists who say that this only women should talk about the Me Too campaign and all this, in which it does ignore a lot of sexual harassment and assault that happens to men. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important. This is not a one gender, one sex issue. This is a population issue where honestly everyone is affected, not at the same numbers, but when we're talking about victims of these incidents, we shouldn't silence anyone, especially if they have a story they need to tell.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. We shouldn't silence anyone, not on moral grounds, though there is that, but just on pure practical ones, on what's the best solution. Solutions that divide aren't solutions. You're creating another problem. We need healing right now, badly. And the solutions to these problems, the lasting long-term holistic solutions, the mosaic solution, as I say. When I say I'm a mosaic feminist, what that means is everybody's a tile on the board. The problem with our intersectional postmodern approach is we are looking at problems through a pinhole. It's our own personal experience, and we give that so much credence that then we have women going, you shut up, men, and then men going, I'm not going to shut up, you shut up. And we've got a new fight instead of resolving the old one. We don't need to gender this issue. We can observe that it is very lopsided just because of who's in particular positions of power in certain industries. We can recognize that without negating or silencing the Terry Cruzes of the world, the blanking on his name, the guy from the Star Trek show that was the first Kevin Spacey accuser. You know, we can give them space, we can include them, we can give them their own tile in the work of art without, you know, acknowledging that, yeah, there's a lot more women dealing with this stuff than men. That's not because there's something inherently more moral about women or inherently evil about men. It is strictly the structural dynamics that have given a minority of men power over the majority of population, men and women alike. And those systemic inequalities are at the core of a lot of these things. And we're not going to solve the problem talking about microaggressions. We're not going to solve this problem with Me Too. We need to actually start looking at the hard realities of income distributions and economic justice. Forget social justice. Let's look at economic justice, because in all these cases, it comes back to money and power. People would probably have done the right thing in a lot of these situations, especially involving Harvey Weinstein, if he wasn't the controller of the purse strings. And that's very important to recognize.
In cases like Harvey Weinstein, who his accusations against him kind of launched this entire topic back into the mainstream, or into the mainstream for the first time, if you really want to look at it. Is it, do you feel that it does just come down to this guy had so much power that if anyone said anything, their career was over? I mean, that you can look at Rose McGowan, kind of see how that played out. And there were so many people that knew that if they all decided to talk earlier, especially some of the, because there's a lot of powerful men who also knew about this but didn't say anything publicly. I forgot who, but someone physically threatened him. Might have been that. I don't want to say any names. I don't want to do that. But,
Brad Pitt had a confrontation with them, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Was there any way to have this come out before now without it coming to what it came to, or is that kind of, or in your opinion, is expecting a little bit too much from the situation since he did have that much power?
Well, we're in an in-between stage now in solutions. Getting rid of Harvey Weinstein will not solve the overall problem of inappropriate behavior in Hollywood. I mean, to pivot from Weinstein to somebody like John Lasseter, that octopus, you know, stretches in so many different directions. That guy lived in a bubble where everything he said was somehow magical. And when you turn people into corporate messiahs, you have a problem. You know, when you deny someone their humanity by being afraid to tell them they're doing anything wrong, that causes real problems. It causes them to lose touch. And, you know, these guys, it's the frog in the boiling water. You know, if you drop a frog in the boiling water, it's going to go, and leap out. But if you gradually turn up the temperature, it'll boil to death. I don't know if that's scientifically true, but that's the metaphor. That's what happens to these guys. they get a bit more power and a bit more power and a bit more power. They don't recognize they're surrounded by yes men. It just happens. People, the socialization in Hollywood is so fake because everybody's hoping that the person they meet on the street, at the drugstore, at a club, in an Uber is going to be the person that gives them their big break. They are so displaced from honesty. It is beyond words. And so they double think their way out of completely inappropriate behavior. And this sounds, it is so hard to explain until you actually see it. The problem is, if you see it, you've already been somewhat programmed into that culture and into that lifestyle. And not only is it creating, you know, our blockbuster summer movies that are crap unless they're directed by indie directors, but it's also causing people to be mistreated in ways that, because of the myths of Hollywood and the assumptions that people make about Hollywood, people are like, well, what did you expect going into that business? Like, you actually expected to be treated decently? That's not Hollywood. That's not the way it works. It's like, Hollywood is one of the few places that someone like, say, a Jennifer Lopez can experience that kind of upward mobility in one lifetime. So you're getting people who don't come, you either have people who come from very rich families, you know, these Hollywood dynasties, or you have, you know, like the Trump kids who daddy's rich so they get to be on a TV show, or you get people from marginalized parts of life with a butt ton of talent, and those people get exploited. You know, those are the Rihannas of the world. Those are, you know, the people like that. And that's the soup you get in Hollywood. Politics is similar in the motif, the trope of the corrupt politician is so pervasive that we're actually at the point that character does not matter in our elected representatives. It's, what are you going to do for me? And it's not that voters are ignoring the transgressions of these politicians. It's that they expected no better. They expected them to be scumbags because they're watching House of Cards and they're watching, you know, these political dramas. Their expectations have been set. But of course, these guys are scumbags. Of course, they're, you know, like having sex with these reporters and then pushing them into a subway car. House of Cards. They expect no better. And so they're like, it's not that I'm not voting for him because he's a scumbag. The perception in voters' minds is, yeah, he's a scumbag, but he's the scumbag we know about, or she's the scumbag we know about. This other, their opponent, is likely just as big a scumbag. We just haven't heard about that yet. And you know, you kind of got into that false equivalency in the Trump-Clinton election, that the media did equate the really racist, sexist, horrible stuff that he was saying with the out of touch, you know, uniquely entitled mistakes that she made. They weren't equivalent at all, but they were treated as such. And so a lot of voters went, well, I don't like either of them. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for the person I think is going to give me what I want, or I'm going to vote for a third party because I can't stand the slime. And harassment and general bullying and abuse of people and dehumanization thrive in environments where scumbaggery, you know, poor morals are expected because of cliches.
Yeah, and first off, R.I.P. Zoe Barnes. She was actually one of my favorite characters in that show, and that brings up a person like Kevin Spacey, who I will be upfront say he was definitely one of my favorite actors since I was a kid, and that's also the case of this is not just females being victimized. He has evidently a lot of allegations throughout his career now from men and women. And And it seems that all of this is happening within the process of less than a month so far. I mean, it's kind of been really a big rush of everything that's happening.
Well, that one was waiting to blow. Yeah. They thought he was too powerful to complain about.
Do you think we're in a, do you think all this is happening too fast, or do you think this all needs to happen right now so we can actually try to progress? Because I think the biggest question is, where do we go from here?
That's like a 3-part question, so I'll try to remember the first 2 parts while I'm answering the first one. Remind me if I don't. Is it happening too fast? I am always hesitant to use comparative analysis in this regard. Too fast compared to what? This is what tends to happen at turning points. The fall of the Soviet Union, you know, the civil rights improvements in the 1960s. These things tend to come in deluges. We end up with imperfect solutions as a result, but we need these deluges to overcome our inertia, the human desire to turn away from horror, stick our heads in the sand, and pretend it's not happening. It's funny because I went back and read Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech just this morning, and you know, he talks about we don't have time for gradualism. And I think there's certainly a feeling now that we do not have time for gradualism when it comes to this issue. But we can't be consumed by the darker urges. You know, we have to, I'm going to misquote him, but this idea of combating attacks of violence with, you know, with attacks of soul. Like, we can't fight fire with fire here. We can't bully the bullies. We can't combat hate with hate. We can't combat bitterness with understanding, with insecurity, with just further insecurity. And I think that's what's happening right now. These op-eds and these Facebook fights and things like that, where men are being told to sit down and shut up. I think that's exactly what's happening. We're fighting insecurity with insecurity. And people are going to pounce all over me for this, but please hear me out. The transgressor's side of the equation is still poorly understood. And it is a very different psychological profile of a guy like Harvey Weinstein, who is a straight up predator. He just abused people. With a guy like Kevin Spacey, which, to hear people who had the misfortune of having to work with him, if he wasn't being inappropriate, he was completely ignoring someone. He seems to lack that basic human connection with other people that the rest of us kind of take for granted. The idea of looking at a person and recognizing them as a human being and not just a tool. From what I've heard, there's something missing in that guy. To a guy like Louis C.K., who's clearly insecure and enabled, and, you know, then a guy like Al Franken, who just seems to be a man-child in a lot of ways, and was encouraged to be a man-child because we sort of equate this idea of comedy with this state of perpetual arrested development. And these are all very different profiles, and I think it's important to understand what makes them different, because it's easy for us to square our own experience with a guy like Harvey Weinstein. There are just terrible people in this world, and they need to be excised from the experiences of other people for the good of all. But someone like a Louis C.K. or an Al Franken or a George Bush, a George H.W. Bush, who's, you know, AIDS admitted, he did give young ladies well-meaning, that was the actual word, well-meaning pats on the bum. And when I read that, I realized, yeah, some of my older relatives, you know, from the old country, from Germany and Lithuania and you know, England, Ireland, Scotland, They did that. It's a little like pat. And that's not the same as somebody like grabbing and squeezing like you're, you know, a pound of ground beef. But for certain women, the intended message and the received message are not the same. And the only way to clarify those instances is to actually have a conversation and actually allow the big bad evil accuser to speak and to be able to give us a sense of what the hell was going through their minds without denying that they did something wrong. They did do something wrong. Al Franken clearly did something wrong, but I want to know what the hell was going through his head, because I want to understand it, because I want to know how to educate people away from that. Because I see a lot of inappropriate behavior going on in other places. I see, you know, I have a lot of discussion because I deal with a lot of entertainers and you know, I worked with the adult film industry for a while, interviewing porn stars for a living. And, you know, the men talked quietly about being groped themselves, and women going up to them at clubs, at appearances, and just kind of helping themselves, squeezing their pecs or grabbing their butt. And it made them feel bad. And that sort of drilled into them because they felt like they weren't allowed to say it made them feel bad. And as we do get closer to gender equality, we need to have space to allow people to have discussions about that, you know, the intersection of race and gender, and how the experience of being a Latino male or a Black male, and you know, a Black male whose family has been American for generations versus a Black male who's an immigrant, things like that. We need to start talking about the differentiation of these experiences and how accordingly touch means something very different, and different types of touch mean something very different to different people. And we have to be culturally resilient enough to have these conversations. And we can't do that on this backdrop of, you know, teachers in critical thinking courses getting complaints about them because they ran something that was triggering. We need to sort of leap into the breach and face the abyss and challenge these things and be able to have a conversation. Because if we don't understand what's driving people to treat other people like meat, we're never going to be able to find an alternative to that nonverbal communication. And people like, oh, you're minimizing it. No, it's a form of communication. It's the bodily equivalent of telling someone they're nothing, right? It's not about the physical damage it does. Grabbing your ass doesn't actually hurt. It's what that communicates about another person's opinion of you that is so harmful. And we need to isolate that and really talk about it. And that's going to be difficult. And I don't think, because of the way these scandals are being handled, I don't think we're in a position to have a productive conversation about that right now. The anger needs to dissipate some. People need to be able to, because people have been locking away anger, you know, when people have a bad reaction to an Al Franken or a Roy Moore or Kevin Spacey or something like that. It's not just philosophical horror. You see it in people who are reliving their own experiences, and people need to recognize that Al Franken is not that guy that made you feel bad. And that's hard when someone has been packing down their own Louis C.K., their own Kevin Spacey, you know, their own, the guy that grabbed Terry Crews at a party and made Terry Crews think, you know, oh, I can see the headlines if I do anything about this. Black man assaults white guy. You know, people are vicariously puking out trauma right now. And all I can hope is that we don't let too many horses out of the barn because somebody set the barn on fire, because we're gonna need those horses when this part of the catharsis is done, and we actually have to tackle the unpleasant task of what are we going to do about that. And I believe that was a second part of your question. What are we going to do about it? What's next? Was that
Yes,
it?
yeah, that's kind of, yeah, yeah. Well, what's the next step? And I think that's actually extremely important. You said a lot of important things, because basically what you described is how criminology into serial killers would go. Because as of right now, I haven't seen any studies to look at the different profiles of accusers and the different sexual misconduct, sexual impropriety, sexual assault, rape. I mean, it's not to minimize anything, but there are differences there, and I think that's important from my perspective as growing up as a male, being in a fraternity in college, and that experience. There, and writing about it quite a bit, there is a societal culturation around men, especially millennial men at this point. It might be changing a bit for post millennials, but that if stuff like this happens, you're supposed, if like for example a Terry Crews situation, if that happens to a guy, there's really not a good environment to talk about that,
Yeah.
because as he's had to deal with on social media, you're immediately gay, or which there's nothing wrong with that, but they immediately question everything about your sexuality, and this isn't talked about a lot either, but in the Black community, that is seen as a detriment. A lot of evangelicals don't like that at all. And even in other cases, even if, for example, if you're a cisgender male, if a woman were to assault you in some ways, like, aren't you supposed to like that, question mark? Like, why are you complaining? Stuff like that. So it's a really tough place to be in, because right now it's like, because especially with coming out and talking about it, it's like how, because I'm sure a lot of men who have gone through something similar that Terry Crews has are looking at how he's been treated and by certain people online. It's like, yeah, if this famous wealthy guy is having to deal with people basically trolling him after he comes out with this, why am I going to talk about it? Because I don't have that support group that he has. And I think that's kind of it's a really sad part of it, and that's something I would want to try to help change and talk about, because all these conversations are difficult. There's difference between sexual harassment and rape. Does that mean that the persons who have to go through that have lesser traumatic experiences? No, but that's
I
what's so
think
difficult about all of it.
If you are treating getting groped at a club as the equivalent to a violent rape, you are lacking empathy for people who have been violently raped. I think it is trauma and status are getting linked in the way we talk about marginalization and victimization. Empowerment has really gone out the window. We're in a victim Olympics right now, and it's true. I mean, part of it is that Black America is just finally getting a for us by us media, to borrow the LL Cool J sneakers brand. But there's finally shows like Blackish, like Dear White People, like, back in my day, and I grew up in a neighborhood where the dominant racial group was Afro-Caribbean. We had In Living Color, and I say we by geography, not by race. Obviously, I'm whiter than Wonder Bread, but we had In Living Color, and that was the show that spoke to our cultural experience living in a hood. There wasn't a hell of a lot out there. Hip hop was just starting to really rise. It became sort of the cool thing in the 90s, and then it started getting appropriated for white kids in the suburbs. And it's not the same thing at all. And I mean, Blackish has dealt with some of those connections to Black masculinity. Dear White People dealt with that. You're Black and gay, holy crap, you know. But, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates is the darling of the moment, but people are treating him like the spokesman for the Black experience instead of one guy with an opinion. And this is happening at the same time as this harassment stuff. And it really does complicate the narrative, because if we're looking at it, this harassment, the Hollywood, all that stuff, with a few notable exceptions, it's being treated like a white problem. And that's not helpful. Again, that whole thing about dividing people instead of bringing them together. The solutions that they're going to come up with for Congress or in, you know, multinational corporations are not going to service people living in Englewood. You know, it's not, they have money and they have status, and they're not dealing with the same pervasive cultural trauma. Like, there are neighborhoods in the US where the average person, you know, neighborhoods in Chicago and things like that, where the average person is showing traumatic symptoms equivalent to a tour in the Middle East. That's why they call it Chirac. And those childhood experiences, those early life experiences do contribute to antisocial behavior as an adult. And it is important to remember that in a lot of cases, victimization is a cycle. It would be great if we could find out what happened to Kevin Spacey at some point to turn him into Kevin Spacey, but I don't know if we're ever going to get there, because that would require an amount of self-awareness that he doesn't have, you know? And the only way we're going to get there is to allow guys like Terry Crews to tell his story. And I believe his name is Anthony Rapp, the guy who accused Kevin Spacey, to tell his story. But then also allow a guy like George Takei to tell his story, who said flat out, absolutely, this did not happen. You know, we got to be careful that we don't just, because it wasn't so long ago that the big deal with, you know, like that George Takei story was not that he was, I mean, jump back only a few years and we have Kevin Clash, right? The guy who was Elmo. And he was accused of impropriety. He lost his career based on the accusation because he was gay. It was a sex scandal with a child performer. You can't have that. You know, if you have anything to do with children, even the accusation destroys you. And that's not fair, because we reproduce sexually as a species. We still have an oddly Puritan attitude towards sex, and we do sort of treat any sexual activity outside of marriage as a bad thing. I mean, don't forget, it wasn't long ago that rape was defined as forced sexual intercourse with someone other than your wife. Only men could rape. Only men could rape by law. And you couldn't rape your wife. And a woman was expected to fight as hard as she could. And if she didn't, that was considered consent. It wasn't sexual assault. And of course, that's not how most people respond. People think it's fight or flight. It's actually not. It's freeze, fight, or flight. And that freeze dynamic happens to men and women alike. I mean, I think that's what Terry Crews kind of described, didn't he? When he didn't do anything. And that's... But he did the right thing. And that's what we don't tell people like Terry Crews. People say to him, you did nothing wrong. He did the right thing, because he's absolutely right about what would have happened had he retaliated. As someone who was in that position, okay, I'm not a guy, and again, whiter than Wonder Bread, but as someone who has been in that situation that was groped publicly and went, no, the way we were trained to back in the 80s and 90s, where we were taught to, you know, how to stab someone in the eye with your high-heeled shoe and carry your keys between your fingers when you're walking to the car. That was the reality of the 1990s. That was self-defense because you couldn't carry pepper spray. It was illegal in Canada. So these are the things we were taught to do. How to punch like you feel it. How to knee a guy in the balls. Well, what was happening is you did your self-defense thing and you went, no, and you shoved the guy away and you were loud and you prevented the assault from getting worse because you called attention to yourself. But then all the people around you turned around and looked at you like, what's your problem? Because they didn't see what the guy was doing. They saw the outburst. And then all the guy has to do, because he's done it before, all they have to do is go, what's your problem, bitch? And he set the narrative. And this is the problem with these things. People don't like disruptions of the script. Scripting is a huge cultural phenomenon, especially in big cities. And people just want these problems to go away. And so they just want the person who is making noise to shut up. And when someone is affluent and white and relatively powerful, they won't shut up. You hear people going, you won't shut me up, right? If you have a different experience, if you grow up in one of these marginalized neighborhoods, what you are taught from a very young age is eventually the system will shut you up. So people just don't talk. They just don't talk. And that's why the face of this problem, other than Terry Crews and Anita Hill, is a white one. And we're not going to get solutions that way, because for every one of these fairly wealthy people, I mean, Rose McGowan lost all her money because of her dad's medical bills, but you know, she's still more well off than a regular person dealing with these problems. People forget, you know, the industry with the highest raw number of complaints, but also rate of sexual harassment complaints, which industry it is?
Do not.
Food services. Hospitality.
That's not.
Waitresses. And it's not just the managers, it's customers. And so figuring out how to stop Harvey Weinstein from being Rapey McRaperson is not gonna help that waitress who goes to work expecting to get her ass grabbed, because what can she do about it? Quit? She's just going to go to the same place, the same neighborhood, and get her ass grabbed or groped elsewhere or cornered in the bathroom. What is she going to do? She can't change careers. Where do you go from waitressing? And
yeah, I think that. But yeah, that brings up a lot. I mean, that definitely details the scope and magnitude of the problem. From where do we go? Because yeah, like right now, especially because you also have people like Bill Cosby and R. Kelly who have done things for kind of not in the same situation. Oddly
Mel
enough,
Gibson,
as people
Roman
like Harvey
Polanski,
Weinstein.
Joss Whedon, I mean, Seth MacFarlane got up at the Oscars and sang a song about "We've Seen Your Boobs." How is that any different than what Al Franken did to Leanne Tweeden? How is going, Jennifer Lawrence, we've seen your boobs? On the biggest night of the year in Hollywood, how is that any different than Al Franken doing the, air grope while Leanne Tweeden's asleep? It's not. It's the same impulse. Boobies. Come on.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess that's part of the hard conversation. Is like, I guess comedy is a completely different thing, but since for comedians seem to have creative license to talk about almost everything and get a pass and do
Not
certain
so much
things
anymore.
and get a.
I was the first female co-host in the longest running comedy late night show in Canada. We couldn't do the show we did now today. It's a much more suppressed culture. However, comedy's not that different. The only different thing about comedy is you do have to get comfortable with the idea that sometimes your jokes are going to bomb. And sometimes you're going to go over the line. And you don't mean to. It's the nature of the beast. And that's why when you get into one of these situations where you have Al Franken, who is a trained comic, and Leanne Tweeden, who is in entertainment, but she is not a trained, practiced, experienced comic, you have two different sets of social norms there. And her experience is completely valid. The mistake Al Franken made there is forgetting she might be a professional. She might be an entertainment professional. She's not a comic. And so you can't just do the big, okay, we're going to do the big sloppy kiss because that's funny. I can almost guarantee you that's what he was thinking. A big, like, the air kiss, that's not funny. He was going for the big vaudeville, like, thing, because that's the trope, but she wasn't prepared for that. That being said, that's why you rehearse. That's why you don't do that for the first time on stage. And the fact that something like We've Seen Your Boobs at the Oscars was able to get through all those levels of vetting. And I mean, Seth MacFarlane's got this very successful show. He's got The Orville on TV, and he's still seen as this great guy. A lot of his humor does come at the detriment of women. And right now, people aren't looking at that stuff. And that pisses me off. I think you can tell, because as a woman who does do comedy, because there tends to be, 12 guys in a writer's room and one woman, 2 women, 3, if you're really lucky, the majority opinion tends to be male, because that's the way it works, right? It's like you go around the room, show of hands, who thinks is funny? What's the most popular bit? Well, when you've got 11 guys in a writer's room and 3 women, which jokes are going to get voted on? Jon Stewart talked about this, that he was really offended by accusations that the Daily Show writer's room was a boys' club. And then he walked in Monday morning after the story dropped and realized they were right. This is an issue that if there is no one, not just sitting in a chair, but empowered for their opinion to matter, then you are going to get skewed cultural perspectives of what's funny. And so now we sort of have this type of comedy that's, it's funny because it's happening to somebody else, and it's this kind of mockery, and women are sort of seen as destroyers of fun. This is a huge thing I have issues with in the video game industry, that it's sort of accepted that, women are destroyers of fun, and a woman comes in the room, all of a sudden we have to put the fun away, be really proper. That's not true. And I don't like that chill that comes into a room full of men I don't know when I walk in. I don't want that. I'm a gamer like anybody else. I enjoy the same games that a lot of guys do for the same reasons a lot of guys do. What we have in common is greater than the things we are different at. I just want the ability to go, guys, not cool, without everybody in the room freaking out like I've just cut off one of their testicles. That's where we need to get. And I don't think the way Me Too is being handled is getting there. I think there's a lot of fear among men now that they're going to be the next accused. Because let's face it, in these cases that we've seen, the accusation seems very much like You know, court of public opinion, you're guilty. You're not allowed to even defend yourself. You are guilty. And that doesn't start dialogue. That doesn't get us more comfortable with each other. That's reinforcing the battle of the sexes.
Do you feel a lot of this also has, you spoke about this earlier, do you feel a lot of that has to do with our, I guess, our Puritan view on sex? Because you mentioned also speaking to adult entertainers, and it does, because I still, like, even when a lot of accusers come forward, it immediately turns into, I've seen a lot of sex shaming. Oh, you were doing this dress like this, that, and that. Do you think that has to be tackled first before we can actually move forward and start hearing everyone and coming to some sort of social resolution? I might even think this is going to be a legal resolution. It's something that society has to decide to move.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I did a TV appearance not too long ago, and one of the things about TV is you have the wireless, like lavalier mics, you know, the ones that kind of stick in your shirt and you run a wire down. Well, you have to run a wire down, and those things aren't made for women's clothing. And there's this uncomfortable moment where this audio tech, who's usually male, has this moment where I see them, right? He says, do you want to put this on or do I? I said, do you want to go rummaging around inside my dress? He's like, no. I'm like, okay, then I'll put it on, you know, and it kind of breaks the ice because there is sort of that comfort. And there's a lot of that in theater, and everybody just kind of laughs. And I mean, for me, because of my Google search and because I did the whole chainmail bikini thing, there's this thing where I have to own it. It's like, you know, I've had a lot of jokes with people I don't know that well. But again, it's that kind of professional code of I'm a professional, they're a professional. There was just a 10-year period in my career where I showed my ass for a living as a professional. That was my job. And until we see that as a skill, we're not going to be able to have these conversations because it's a lot like, you know, somebody will say, oh, you look really different or something like that. And then you see them look super guilty. And I go, oh, you mean I'm wearing clothes? And you see them kind of blush and go, yeah, but I've made it okay. Right? Now they know they can't take it too far. But there is this discomfort, not recognizing it. I mean, I come from the theater world before I was on TV, and so it's so strange to me. Because when you're doing theater, and this is why it was such a transgression what Kevin Spacey did at the Old Vic. When you're doing theater, you do have to run off stage. Like you are maybe 5 feet from the stage, and you're throwing off all your clothes, and you usually have like this sheer body stocking underneath, but that's it. But you're throwing off all this, and you're putting your next costume on, and you're running back, and then you go on stage like nothing happened, right? You don't have time for modesty. You don't have time to worry about whether the stagehand grabbed your butt deliberately or not while they were zipping you up or something like that. There's a lot of contact in the arts. And unfortunately, one of the things you have to do when you're teaching dance or any kind of movement training is to get young people used to, you know, the center of mass for women tends to be the hips, right? So when you're doing lifts and stuff like that, people are putting their hands on you in places that you have been socially taught people are not supposed to put their hands. And we have this overall shame about sex and about bodies that mean that people can use that shame to gain power over us. And I do think that the ultimate solution to this is to become less shame of healthy sexuality and body and our bodies. So people like Harvey Weinstein can't use it to menace people because we're not really talking about sex here. We're talking about control and power and status, right? And if we start looking at it in that way, things become a lot more simple, if that made sense.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense because it does seem a lot of this comes down to because, for example, as we talked about with with groping, if I think if we didn't have society made everything sex shaming so bad and wants to point towards a victim of something, that could immediately be dealt with in society. Like, hey, you don't do that, stop it, so we wouldn't have to make it into a traumatic experience where someone feels shame about it.
That's right.
Of course, that's not the same thing as about rape. That's something that is different, and we should see that as different. But we still shouldn't. Just definitely shouldn't shame those people either, because what choice did they have when you come down to their power was taken away? All this stuff does boil down to I want to assume the power over you because I believe you can't do anything about it afterwards. I'm going to get away with it, and I think that's where it comes down to, and that comes down to from just changing society as a whole, and that's why to me it looks difficult. And before we wrap up, what are some things that you'd like to immediately be changed that you think would do the most good for society?
Well, for one, I don't think there's any substitute for two people having an adult conversation with each other. And I think that there is a discouragement in our ride sharing, house sharing, crowd sharing, sharing culture, this idea of everybody being stuffed into the same space. People have lost their sense of personal boundaries and lost the sense that it's okay to say you don't like something. I think we have to come back to that and have it respected. You know, because what tends to happen, grow a thicker skin, or everybody jumps in and decides whether somebody has the right to not like something. Instead of recognizing that individual preferences and boundaries matter, we've almost made it like everything's got to be a diagnosis. So there's a safe space because they have trauma, and a safe space does not solve the problem of not feeling like you can vocalize in your everyday life your likes and dislikes. Now, some of that does come culturally. Some of that comes from the self and people having a different relationship with themselves, developing healthy self-esteem. Self-esteem comes through try, fail, try again, fail, try again, fail, try again, succeed. And unfortunately, a lot of people have not really been allowed to meaningfully fail and get back up again. It's one shot with everything. We're a one-shot culture. And nobody great did it on the first try. So that's part of it. We really do need to get better at talking to each other. And managers and CEOs and, thought leaders and people who are role models have to set the example of extending themselves in a way that isn't, well, my door is open. BS. Just because your door is open doesn't mean somebody's going to walk through it. Walk through their door. You're the one with power. It's not enough for a manager to say my door is always open. You know why? Because people see you going through that door. And if somebody walks into the manager's office, then it's, what happened? What did you say? My husband worked at a company where there was a human resources department, but they weren't involved on a day-to-day. And so people knew if they saw somebody going into human resources, it was a complaint. So you know what people didn't do? They didn't go to human resources because managers heard they went there or somebody saw them, and then they started punishing that person for that. They didn't know why, but, guilty conscience. And if, HR was more effective, they'd be periodically checking in with people. It's the same way that we normalized AIDS testing back in the 90s and the early 2000s, where if everybody got an AIDS test, then insurance companies couldn't stigmatize you for getting an AIDS test. And then they did. It's like, oh, you had an AIDS test. Does this mean you're gay? And if you're gay, you're a gay male, you're at heightened risk for other diseases and you're a poor risk. So insurance companies were penalizing people for taking care of their health. Interactions with HR are the same way, that if you only go to HR when there's a problem, people don't go to HR at all. And there needs to be a whole kingdom, not the church attitude that HR is actually human resources. It's not a very expensive complaint department. People have to get in there. It's no different than working with, what we used to call at-risk youth. You don't wait for them to come to you. Hell no. Some, 15-year-old kid whose dad was never around and there's guys roaming in and out of the house, he's not going to come talk to you about it. You have to establish a rapport with that young man or that young woman that may already be a mom at 14. You have to establish a rapport with them. You have to come to them. And employees are no different. You got to get down with them and be on their level and get the sense that you are not judging them. You are their ally before they're going to talk to you. A lot of these HR departments are more about covering asses than actually solving problems. And we have to move to that paradigm. And we know how to do it because, my peer facilitator colleagues and the people I work with, they go in there and they save and prolong lives every single day using these, using facilitation techniques. Companies just have to recognize that your success as a company is not just about your balance sheet. Your success as a company is, are your employees happy to come to work every day? Really happy, not just telling you they're happy. And, when you see the turnover rates that you see in Hollywood, in Washington, and in Silicon Valley, an average employee tenure of 1.9 years, which is what it is at Google, and that's high for Silicon Valley, that is not an indication of a happy workforce. And these, employee retention needs to become a mark of a company. Like if people are selecting jobs, if the people in positions of power are selecting jobs based on companies being well run in terms of staff satisfaction, then we've got something. And that's just good business as well, because happy employees work smarter, so you get more out of them in a 40-hour work week than you would with a miserable employee on an 80-hour work week. And this is all bundled together. But that is definitely where I'd start, is completely rethinking the idea of HR. And Momo has blessed you with his presence. Here's Momo. Hello, Momo. You heard me talking about nice things and you decided to join us, did you? Hello.
Cats are definitely welcome here. And
HR department should be like Momo. He just showed up to give love. Hey.
There's definitely a ton more. There's definitely a ton more we could talk about, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity before we have to wrap up to promote everything that you're doing and where people can find you to hear about more about this and projects that you are working on.
Well, I'm very active on Twitter, Red Liana K. That's probably the best place to follow me if you are a tweeter. Not so active on Facebook, but you can like my fan page on Facebook, Liana K. It's the one with me in a Princess Leia metal bikini, not the one automatically generated by Wikipedia. Or you can go to my YouTube channel, Liana K, and there you can watch Lady Bits, which is my new series about asking difficult questions regarding women in gaming, intended to start a discussion instead of being the final word. And it's been really successful. We've been having a lot of fun. Chainmail bikinis are involved in the most recent episode, which was kind of terrifying, but I'm now glad I did it. And yes, Momo does make appearances as well, right, Momo? But that's what I'm doing right now. And I am also involved in the FU network, at the SOC Live Thursdays at 9:00. You can watch live on Facebook, or you can watch the recording on YouTube as well.
Okay, it's definitely great to have you. And I have been a gamer for as long as I remember, so pretty much my whole life. I definitely would like to have you want to talk more about that as well in the future. And it's definitely a great discussion, and I hope people can get something out of this so we can actually move forward as a society and try to heal instead of create more wounds, which sometimes some of the conversation seems to be doing. But
Yeah, I would
it
love
definitely
to
was
be able
great.
to. I would love to be able to come on these shows and talk about video games instead of this stuff. I mean, I'm all about Cuphead. I'm kind of obsessed with Cuphead. It would be great to be able to have happy conversations, but I get that we've got to do the work. So yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back and talk about video games.
All right, great. And I do hope you have a great rest of your day, and everyone listening. Follow, subscribe. We'll definitely have more on topics like this and some lighter things coming in the future as well.